Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on NHC I podcast, and I am joined by Dr. Samuel Zinner, and today we're talking about the Apocryphon of James. I have the link to the History by Amazon affiliate link in the description below, and it's pinned in the live chat, and it will also be in the pinned comment below, right below the description of this video, when this video is over. That being said, it's good to have you back on History by podcast, Samuel.
It's always good to be here.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. Can you tell everybody, for those that may not have heard of this text before, what exactly the Apocryphon of James is?
Well, it's a text from the Hammadi library, right? A famous collection of so-called Gnostic codices. Right? Apocryphon, just a Greek loan word that means, loosely translated, it's a secret book. So the secret book of James, and it's from one of the, as I said, one of the Hammadi codices, right? And I think the best way to describe it, right, for a general audience would be that we see in it, one might call it a combination, right, of traits that are often identified as Gnostic, but others that are often identified as Jewish Christian, also Hermetic. Right, so we have the end of the text, right, it culminates with the narration of a visionary ascent to the heavens, right, and expressed in language reminiscent of Hermetic literature, but also of Jewish apocalypses, ancient Jewish apocalypses, and specifically the parables of Enoch from the book of Enoch. And it's basically covering the teachings of Jesus to his brother James over an 18-day period. Right? And very Jewish Christian, I think. For instance, the cross of Jesus, or the death of Jesus, are not understood salvifically, as in Pauline theology, but it's understood as more of a role model, a model to be imitated for the sake of bravery. Right? For instance, contrary to the canonical gospels, like the little apocalypse, as it's called in Mark 13, and then later read in Matthew 24, which urges the followers of Jesus to flee, right, before the assault on Jerusalem, which sort of culminated in 70 of the Common Era with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Jesus in the Apocryphon of the Secret Book of James urges his followers not to be cowards and flee. Right, so that sort of implies to stay and resist, right, the Roman assault. And there's a stress on life and knowledge, right? And repetition of the noun, at least it's right in Greek, it would be a single noun, but anyway, the word, right, which is traditionally, right, already in Deuteronomy 30, is a title for the Torah. So it's a sort of a Torah-based message that Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, has for his brother James.
So is the Apocryphon of James basically trying to expand on details of James's life, trying to fill in the blanks in ways that the earlier Christian literature did not?
Not to a marked or considerable degree, I would say, right? Because it's really basically an account of Jesus' teaching to James and to Peter, right? And then at the end, of course, there's an allusion to the ascent of James to Jerusalem, right? Following, of course, the visionary ascent I mentioned to heaven. Right? So, sort of the conclusion of the text, but the main body of the text, right, is Jesus teaching his brother James. So it's really not too much right? Not so much filling in what we don't know from the New Testament, for instance, about James, but really just an expansion of the teachings of Jesus.
When it comes to the ascent of James part,
Mhm.
would you say that there's connections there between the ascent of James in terms of like a relationship to the pseudo-Clementine literature about James succeeding Jesus as the leader of the movement, and also kind of akin to the Gospel of Thomas?
Sure. Yeah, and I would say that I agree with you. And there's also, to support that, is the fact that there is a rather clear echo and reworking in the Apocryphon of James of the 13th Logion of the Gospel of Thomas. At least for those who are familiar with Thomas, right, that's a famous Logion, Logion 13. And that has to do with Jesus asking his disciples, tell me who I am. What's your opinion about me? Right? And so in the canonical Gospels, of course, different opinions are given. This prophet returns, the prophet of old returned, and then, of course, Peter says, no, you're the Messiah. That's his insight. But in the Gospel of Thomas, the saying or the question is answered not with Peter saying you're the Messiah, but there are different opinions given. One by Matthew, you're like a philosopher. One by Peter, you're like a righteous angel or an angel of righteousness, which, by the way, is a term that is well known in ancient Jewish and Jewish Christian literature. The angel of righteousness has a very prominent role in the Shepherd of Hermas, for example. Anyway, but then Thomas responds, well, teacher, my mouth is not able to say what you are. And then Jesus responds, basically, well, you're blessed, you're enlightened, and I'm not your teacher. Right? The meaning of that is, I think one can understand it from the background of Philo's teaching, Philo of Alexandria. His doctrine on self-teaching, on self-learning, the self-taught saint, right, or a patriarch. Right, so one has to be motivated to learn through one's own powers of study and enlightenment. And so the basic message is that Jesus is not the teacher of Thomas. Thomas is his own teacher, basically. He's enlightened himself, right? So Jesus as a teacher, right, his role is to prepare the student to become his own teacher. Right? And that's followed by Jesus taking Thomas aside alone. So there are three disciples there, Matthew, Peter, and Thomas. And Jesus takes Thomas apart alone and tells him three words, right, which could mean three sayings or three things, right? But in any case, when Thomas returns to his fellow students, fellow disciples, they say, whoa, what did Jesus tell you? And Thomas, says, if I told you one of the things he told me, fire would come from the sky and burn you up. Well, that's very strikingly similar to the Babylonian Talmud in the tractate Chagiga, right, which is all about chariot mysticism, right, and Bereshit, or creation mysticism, right, which has accounts, these stories of people who were not ready to receive instruction about the mysteries of the Merkabah, and the result was that fire comes down from heaven and burns them up. But according to Chagiga, right, one should not be instructed in the mysteries of the Merkabah. It should not be revealed to three, nor to two, not even to one alone, unless they are self-motivated, self-inspired to learn of themselves. So it's really an amazing parallel. And there is an echo and a reworking of that whole scene, that whole saying in the Apocryphon of James. So there's definitely a connection there.
What exactly is the 18 days after the suffering?
Well, there's difference of opinion, of course. There always is on these types of matters. But so I'll give you my interpretation, which is in my just published commentary on the Apocryphon of James. According to this text, Jesus, in my interpretation, Jesus remains in heaven for 550 days, right, after his crucifixion. Right? After this, he descends to earth for an 18-day period of teaching. Right? So he's teaching basically James, but also Peter. And the 18 days begins on the third of the month of Tishrei, right? If we assume the traditional crucifixion in the year 30 of the Common Era on the 14th of Nisan, right? So this beginning on the 3rd of Tishrei, 550 days, right, after this presumed 14 Nisan crucifixion and 30 of the Common Era. And so that 18 days would then end on the 21st, of course, of Tishrei, which would be Hoshana Rabbah, right, the conclusion to the 7 days of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. And what's interesting about this is returning to earth at that point. Well, that's basically right. He returns for Rosh Hashanah. Basically, the first he gets there for the first 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, which is traditionally called the Yom Hadin, right, the Day of Judgment. It's the annual Day of Judgment, which anticipates the eschatological eternal Day of Judgment. Right, and so right, the other ancient literature mentions this, something like over 500-day period, right, before Jesus returns definitively, right, to heaven from the earth, and like the Pistis Sophia, I believe, but definitely this is one of those texts as well, as is the Martyrdom and Ascension of Isaiah, which is slightly different. It says that after 3 days, Jesus, after 3 days plus 545 days, which is 548 days, right, Jesus would then return to earth, right, and that would put it again on that is a little different to put it on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, right? So it seems that this 550-day motif has something to do with Rosh Hashanah if we are presuming the traditional 14th Nisan date for the crucifixion in 30 CE. So he would be returning to earth on Rosh Hashanah of the next year, the 31 of the Common Era. And there's a leap year involved there, right? So when one does the calculation, one has to take that into account. So it would seem to me that that's the whole point of this. It has Jesus staying in heaven for 550 days. He returns to earth for Rosh Hashanah to be the representative of God, right, for the Day of Judgment. And for these 18 days that culminate with the conclusion of Sukkot, right, which we do see allusions to the rituals of Sukkot in this text. Right, that's the basic message. Parables of the kingdom of the word, which again is the title for the Torah, at least as interpreted by Jesus in this text to his brother James and Peter. So it has to do with like Rosh Hashanah, the 10 days of repentance between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, right? And then the Feast of Sukkot or Tabernacles. So the teachings really become most lucid when one takes into account the Jewish calendar and the setting therein that seems to be alluded to in this text.
And how does the text view the kingdom? And is it trying to say that few will make it into the kingdom?
Well, probably the few, but also there is this looking forward to a multitude of beloved ones, right, in the future that will enter the kingdom. And that's sort of based on the Tanakh trope, right, the Hebrew Bible trope, right, of the exiles returning, right, the Jewish exiles to Babylon returning, right, to Judah, returning to Israel, right. And so this becomes the coming of the beloved ones, right, which James and his successor, will deal with, right, the salvation of these coming beloved ones. The notion, that the chosen are few, right? We know that from the synoptic gospels, but it's also we find it in Jewish literature, right? Like especially in there's some nice parallels to that idea in the Jewish apocalypse known as Fourth Ezra, right? Also known as Second Esdras, but Fourth Ezra, has the same idea that at least comparatively speaking, right, those who will be lost, right, the number is larger than the number of those who are elect or chosen. Of course, elected, chosen, right? That's a traditional title for Israel, right? The chosen people, the elect, right? So that's playing in the background, right, in this text when it talks about the elect and the chosen, right? There's a hint there at the children of Israel. So again, I think that's a pointer to at least a layer of this text being, what some call Jewish Christian, right? Which is of course a loaded term and is understood differently by different scholars, but right, it's for me, is a term referring to many different groups, right, which had a widely diverse rituals and praxis and beliefs, but they're all sort of united to various degrees by certain commonalities, such as some kind of devotion, more of a devotion to Judaism or the Torah, right, than would be the case, for instance, within the communities in the Pauline, Gentile trajectory. And of course, the complexion of the teachings, right, are secrets, right, the esoteric, right. So that goes hand in hand with this notion of a small group, right, who number few compared to the crowd, the multitude, right? And of course, one can probably read into that historically the feeling of small Jewish Christian communities compared to the burgeoning Pauline movement, right, which is open to large numbers of non-Jews, Gentiles, right? So there's probably that dynamic at play as well.
When it talks about the second coming of Jesus, is it different from how the New Testament talks about it, or is it roughly the same?
Well, one has to take into account that, right, even in the New Testament, there's some differentiation in this idea. So there is seemingly this concept of some kind of an apocalyptic eschatological return of Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels, for instance, or the first chapter of the book of Revelation. On the other hand, famously in the Gospel of John, we have a different model. There are different layers in there, but at least one of those is prominent, and that's sort of like what we call a realized eschatology. And right in the Last Supper discourse, for instance, it's sort of hinted in there, that the second coming of Jesus has already occurred in a spiritual mode, right? And that seems to be also present, for instance, out in the Gospel of Thomas, for instance. And I think it's sort of hinted at in the Apocryphon of James, actually. But, also in the Synoptic Gospels already, we have some kind of realized eschatology at work, right? Famously, right, in the account of the Transfiguration, for instance, if you read there in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, you'll notice that the lead up or the introduction to the story of the Transfiguration of Jesus is Jesus' promise, right, that the Son of Man will come before some of those who are standing there listening to Jesus teach die, right? So then that to be followed immediately by the story of the Transfiguration strongly implies that the story of the Transfiguration was understood, right, as the second coming, or the coming of the Son of Man, right? So it's spiritualized even there. Of course, that's not the only way that the second coming is understood in the Gospels. There are different beliefs, right, in the different layers of those canonical texts. But one of the layers there is definitely this idea of a spiritualized second coming. Right? So, one can see the Apocryphon of James sort of reflecting the same thing. Right? This is sort of different aspects, different layers to this notion of the second coming of Jesus, which sort of resists, a monolithic portrayal or depiction or explanation of that idea, right? So I think these early followers of Jesus were still working things out, consciously and unconsciously, right? They were still working things out. They had not arrived at a systematic theology, right, which was to come later, right, in the later church fathers, and then, of course, in the Middle Ages with the peripatetic church philosophers and theologians like Thomas Aquinas, for instance.
And how does the text understand salvation in relation to flesh? Does it make a connection between those 2 points at all?
Yes, it does. I think, again, we can't be too systematic, but there is clearly the author of the Apocryphon of James is familiar with Philo of Alexandria's anthropology, right? So there is this, let's say, tendency, or let's say animus against materiality, physicality, but that shouldn't be exaggerated too much, right? Because salvation also pertains to the body, to the flesh, right? In that Philonic model, which is then echoed in the Apocryphon of James. But of course, it's through the nous, through the mind, through the intellect and the divine intellect in the human intellect, that the psyche or the psyche is saved, and through that and the pneuma, right, then the soma, right, or even the sarx, attains salvation, right? So it's probably a risk here, but I would say it seems to be an attempt at a holistic anthropology, what we call anthropology, right, in New Testament studies. Again, it strongly echoes the language, the terminology that Philo of Alexandria uses. And one has to keep in mind, again, there's that in Philo, who is participating in the Platonic trajectories, right? There is this sort of what we call an animus against materiality, physicality, corporeality. At the same time, we shouldn't exaggerate that too much, misunderstand it. For example, later, the Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus, right, it was said that, right, he said, according to, I think it was Porphyry, the student, that Plotinus never felt at home in his own body. I think this is an exaggeration. And if you read the Aeneads, right, the classic work of Plotinus, which he himself didn't write, but right, they were written down. The notes were taken from his lectures, right, by his student Porphyry. That the understanding of materiality is not simply that it's evil. Right? It's a very qualified and differentiated doctrine that we find in Plotinus. It's just not a simple spirit, mind, non-materiality good, materiality totally evil. No, it's much more sophisticated and qualified than that. And so I think we have the same tension in the Apocryphon of James, right, between the negativity of the material and sort of a positive outlook on the divine spirit, right? Because there's sort of a negative outlook on the natural psyche, right? And just to throw it in there for those who lament Platonic philosophy's derision of the body compared to the mind. I would just rejoin that. I would respond to that by saying, anyone who's really suffered physically, right, can be sympathetic to this derision of the human body. Of course, it has to be balanced. Right? It has to be balanced, and I think Plato, the Platonic trajectory, Philo, who's in like the middle Platonic period, and then Plotinus in the Neoplatonic period. I think they're all more qualified and differentiated on this point, right? Than is usually than they're usually given credit for. Usually, there's a caricature, right? There's caricature involved, and sort of denigrating Plato and Greek philosophy because it's not integrating the material and the immaterial sufficiently. Anyway, enough of that. We find the same tension in the Apocryphon of James.
And what about when it talks about the fall of the neighbor's house? Can you tell us a bit about that in relationship to the fall of the temple? How does it view the temple destruction?
Well, I think that the way to best understand that is through the prism of that accompanying exhortation of Jesus that, this language is not used explicitly, sorry, so I'm going to use paraphrase, of course, in exegetical or interpretative paraphrase, right, to tell you what the text means, in my opinion. Right, that's connected with the saying of Jesus' exhortation not to flee Jerusalem like cowards, right, when the enemy approaches, right? So this seems to be alluding, right, to the First Jewish War. But it probably has an application, of course, to a later period when the Apocryphon of James was, put together, when it was composed. I think that was during the Kaitos War, but be that as it may. The original application of this, right, of course, came out of the discourse about the first Jewish war, right, which mainly culminated, right, in 70 of the Common Era with the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. I mean, that was not the end of the war, right? But that was sort of the high point of the tragedy, or the lowest part of the tragedy for Jews. Right. And so clearly, this is not a pro-Roman text, like at least some layers of the canonical Gospels. Quite right to the contrary, right? And so then there is this in this teaching about a house that falls. What's going on there, and of course I can't go into detail. The listeners can certainly read the text for themselves. But what I detect in there is that the Apocryphon of James there is combining traditions. Right, one of the traditions is found in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, and that is the parable about the house, right, built on sand, and then the house built on a rock, right? With the later tradition in Matthew 16, where Jesus calls Peter the rock on which the church, ecclesia, will be built. Right, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. But anyway, even in Matthew, those two are linked. Right, Matthew 7, the thing about the house being built on a rock, and the waves and the winds and all that beat against it, and it does not fall. Is certainly, I mean, it's to me, it seems rather clear that is a deliberate, intentional anticipation to the later story about Peter being the rock of the church that will not fall, right? Will not be destroyed by the powers of death. Right? And so it's called the ecclesia, or the church, the community, in Matthew 16. But in the Apocryphon of James, it's called a house, right? Which is another title for the temple, right? And so it seems that there is this idea in Matthew that the ecclesia, well, there's probably two different layers in Matthew. One was probably one without a negative animus about the temple, right? And so that Jesus would build a community wouldn't necessarily imply any low opinion of the temple. It's not that the community is going to replace the temple, right? But there may be a layer of that kind of thinking that's that's been added right there in the final version of Matthew that we have, right? I don't sense that so much in the Apocryphon of James, right? But what is important, I think, is to at least realize that passage in the Apocryphon of James that refers to the neighbor and to the house falling and all of this, that is definitely another form of the tradition that we find in Matthew. Whether or not it's dependent on Matthew is another question, but it's certainly the same body of tradition somehow is coming to expression there. And those who are really interested should read the text and read that passage and make up their minds for themselves on how this is being greeted. But as I say, I think that is slightly different from Matthew. In fact, in one respect, it's dramatically different, right? I'll end answering this particular question by going back to the beginning again, right? And noting that in the Apocryphon of James, Jesus tells them, don't be cowards when basically the Romans come, right? Stand your ground, right? So is definitely anti-Roman. So it seems to me that the feeling would be that the Romans' destruction of the temple was was a just outright and out tragedy, not something to be celebrated with some kind of Christian supersessionist theology.
Is there a relationship at all, a literary relationship between the canonical Epistle of James and the Apocryphon of James?
That's a difficult question. And as you know, probably every scholar, right, will have a slightly different opinion. But there are probably different groups. We could group scholars and their opinions. One would be yes, and one would be no. That there is a literary relationship, and there isn't. It's a difficult question. I'm not always as confident as some. Being able to identify direct literary relationships. I think we do see. I think we can identify some direct literary relationships and some indirect literary relationships throughout the Apocryphon of James with many texts. I would say that there are some striking similarities between the Apocryphon of James, with certain passages in it, and the canonical letter or epistle of James. I'm inclined to see the similarities. We could probably best explain them as this is the result of a community that has inherited the teaching of James through various sources, the historical James, through various sources, one of which would have been the canonical letter of James, right? But there would have been other sources as well. Some that we may know of existed, which have been lost to us through the vicissitudes of history, but I wouldn't find it surprising, right, if the author of the Apocryphon of James was familiar with the letter of James. I'm struggling with it because I believe the answer has to be dialectical. And of course, for many in an audience, when you start using dialectical language, they'll accuse you of contradicting yourself, being self-contradictory. But dialectics, right, is an important part of rhetoric, an important part of logic and philosophy. That is, that sometimes an answer will simultaneously contain answers that do, on some levels, conflict with each other. And so I would say, it would seem to me that the community behind this text, probably one person wrote it, but belonged to a community. So the letter of James was probably known to that community. But whether or not the Apocryphon of James is consciously citing the letter of James as the letter of James, that I'm sort of doubtful of. I think that the teaching of the letter of James was something that had become common in that community, right? And so a lot of the phrases, for instance, and tropes are going to show up, but not maybe as like direct citations from the letter of James, but right, reflecting the influence through long years of circulation and reading of the letter of James in that community, if that makes sense. Right? And but I think it's important because direct or indirect, there is some relationship to the letter of James, the traditions in the letter of James. So this is a much earlier piece of evidence for the existence of the letter of James than a lot of scholars would probably be aware of, because most of them would say, well, it's only first heard of at a very late date. I think that we have that this is some kind of evidence for the existence of a letter of James already at this period, which I believe is the period of the Kaitos War, which is 115 to 117 of the Common Era. Right? Some years that's under Trajan, before the then Bar Kokhba revolt under Hadrian, right, which was 132 to 135 of the Common Era.
Do you think that the text is an original Greek composition, or is there evidence at all that it was originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic?
I'm pretty confident that we're dealing with a Greek text. It's composed in Greek. However, there is, very intriguing reference to Hebrew letters, right? That this is being written in Hebrew letters. In my commentary, I raised the possibility that this may not be a claim, right? Or a pseudo claim, right? That this was the Apocryphon of James was originally written in Hebrew. It could be a claim that it's written in Greek, but with Hebrew letters, right? And this praxis is very well known, right, throughout different cultures, right? Writing in the Judeo-Arabic, for instance, you write in Arabic with Hebrew letters. You could do the reverse, of course, right? And there are many cultures who've done this, right? You write in one language with the script of another, right? And there are all sorts of unique historical reasons, right, for those combinations in the different examples I'm referring to, whether that's dealing with Syriac, Hebrew, Greek, or whatever, right? So definitely we're dealing with something that was originally written in Greek, but the reference to Hebrew letters is just another element. However we interpret that is just another piece of evidence that the community that's behind this text, right, I think has a stronger interest, let's say, in Judaism, right, than the communities of the Pauline trajectories.
And when would you date the text?
As I've already mentioned, I think it's the best way, the most, what I feel most confident about would be a dating in the Kaitos, during the Kaitos War. Why? Well, it's definitely after the destruction of the temple, right, the year 70 of the Common Era. And, right, because it has that sort of hint, right, at the assault by the Romans on Jerusalem, and Jesus tells the disciples, don't be cowards and run away and flee to the mountains. But so it's after that. So it's going to be, that's going to be hinting at a new situation where you can apply this saying to a new situation. The new situation, right, we have two main choices. There are always other possibilities, but I think most probable we have two possibilities. That would be the Kaitos War, right, under Trajan in 115 to 117, the Common Era, or the Bar Kokhba revolt, right, of 132 to 135 under Hadrian, right, in the Common Era. So why would I, gravitate towards the earlier dating rather than the later Bar Kokhba revolt? Because I really don't see, I cannot find, maybe others could, but I myself cannot find any hints, right, let alone explicit, or strong hints. But I can't even find any subtle hints at the figure of Bar Kokhba, right? I can find one of those subtle hints at Bar Kokhba, for instance, in the Gospel of John, right? I won't go into the details, right, of that. But anyway, in the Apocryphon of James, I can't find anything similar to that, right? And so we're dealing with some period of war. I can't find any hints at a pseudo-Messiah, right, which is how the followers of Jesus would have viewed Bar Kokhba, at least the Pauline followers, right? There could have been Jewish, a couple of scholars in recent years have argued that there could have been Jewish Christian followers of Bar Kokhba, right? They could have seen Bar Kokhba as the second coming of Jesus, for instance. Buchholz, in his commentary on the gospel, on the Apocalypse of Peter, for instance, argued that, and I find that persuasive. In any case, so it's related, it's hinting at some war. So we can't find any trace of Bar Kokhba in there, which we sort of can, I think, in other ancient Christian or Jewish Christian texts. But in this one, I don't see it. And so it seems to me safer to place it during the Kaitos War. And a supporting piece of evidence, I would say, again, there would be differences of opinion on this, but I really can't. I side with Costa and others on this issue. I can't be. I'm not convinced that the Apocryphon of James knows the Gospel of John. It seems to me that the Apocryphon of James was written in an intermediate period after the canonical Gospels. The canonical synoptic Gospels, but before John. There is like Johannine-like sounding phrases in the Apocryphon of James, but I don't see any like clear, even reworked citations or allusions to the Gospel of John, which I date into the, as I said, in the period of right after, immediately after the Bar Kokhba revolt. Right. That's similar to the Gospel of Thomas, for instance. Right, we see very clear parallels to the Synoptic Gospels, but the sort of Johannine-like sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, they don't seem to be fully Johannine, as if it's before the Gospel of John, like some intermediate way of speaking about Jesus, post Synoptic Gospels, but pre-Johannine. Right? We find that same thing in the Odes of Solomon. Right? There are these Johannine-like terms and phrases and ideas, but we really can't be confident that whoever wrote the Odes of Solomon was knew the Gospel of John. I don't think they did, because I don't think the Gospel of John had been written yet. So the Apocryphon of James is very similar to those two texts, Gospel of Thomas and the Odes of Solomon, in that seems to be aware of this community that had a way of speaking about Jesus and thinking about Jesus that some decades away was crystallized in the Gospel of John, but it had not been crystallized at this point. Right? So I think this comes before the Gospel of John. Theoretically, that could be during the Bar Kokhba revolt, if the Gospel of John was written just immediately after the Bar Kokhba revolt. Sure, but again, I don't find any hints at the figure of Bar Kokhba in the Apocryphon of James. So my only other option there is then, instead of going far, far, far beyond Bar Kokhba revolt, I'll go back and put it in the time of the Kaitos War.
We have a super chat question from Foundations. Thank you for your super chat. In the New Testament, Jesus advises fleeing before Jerusalem's fall, but in the Apocryphon, his followers are urged to fight. Why change the message post-fall?
Right, because this old tradition, right, when it's applied to a new situation, is going to be reworked, right? As simple as that. So in the New Testament, there's this exhortation, right? When you see Jerusalem surrounded, then flee to the mountains, right? So one would think that was written before the event. There are, of course, differences of opinion on that. But in any case, when you have an earlier tradition, that you are using for a new situation, right? It's natural. It's what happens in ancient literature. Right? It gets reworked, right? And it can be reworked in a slight way or in a radical way. Here it's reworked in a radical way. Right? So it's urging now under the during the Kaitos War. Okay, now stand your ground and don't flee like cowards. Right?
How does the Apocryphon of James understand the crucifixion? How does it view it, and how does it view its significance, and also the resurrection as well?
All right, as far as the crucifixion, it's understood as a tragic act. Well, it's a tragedy that was committed by the evil Romans, basically. So it sort of has an anti-Roman setting, right? So or animus. And it's, as I said before, it is the crucifixion and the death of Jesus are not understood salvifically, right? So it doesn't assure salvation. You save yourself according to Jesus' teaching and the Apocryphon of James. So the death of Jesus on the cross, the crucifixion, is presented as as a model to follow, right? And that ties in with the previous question that we had. Don't flee, but stand your ground. But the expectation seems to be that they will fall. They will not be cowards and flee, but they will stand and be killed, right, by the Romans, right for the sake of freedom. And not only spiritual freedom, but it seems to be this worldly freedom, right? Standing up for Jerusalem, the land of Israel. Right? The resurrection also it's not a saving event, right? Because again, Jesus teaches in the Apocryphon of James that the disciples are to save themselves. Save yourselves. In fact, that's the exact words that are used by imitating, right, the example of Jesus as a brave resistor, right? And the resurrection itself is understood as an event, right, as sort of along the lines of the ascent of Enoch, or assumption of Enoch, right? So, and this is not the only early Christian text that seems to imply that. So the model for the resurrection, where this idea come from, is that Jesus experienced a visionary ascent to the heavens. The resurrection was spiritual, right? So according to the Apocryphon of James, Jesus was not buried in a cave, but right, in accord with what we know from history, he was buried for crucifixion victims in general. It was burial in a shallow ditch in the vicinity of the crucifixion itself, right? So the resurrection is an ascent of the spirit, a visionary ascent. So what happens to the body? Well, this seems to be up in the air. It's really doesn't seem to be that much of an issue. It doesn't seem to be a concern, right? So the resurrection also coincides with the ascent of Jesus to heaven. It's the same event, really, right? And so, as I said, then he stays in heaven, according to this text, for 550 days, then returns to earth, right, for an 18-day teaching period, And then he goes back to heaven permanently to sit at the right hand of God. And then the beloved ones, as they're called, which are then, their coming is foretold in the time of the successor of James, whoever that is, probably the recipient of this Apocryphon of James. Right? And so that, again, as I said before, sort of echoes the meme in the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible of, the exiled Jews returning to the land of Israel. Right? So it seems to be that it's a very Jewish and national model, right, at work here, right, regarding the second coming or the return of Jesus, and the coming of these basically, returnees, right, from the exile. In other words, right, this is also known in the canonical Gospels, in the Gospel of Matthew, for instance, where Jesus says, I didn't come for the Gentiles, I come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, those 10 lost tribes, for instance, right? And so those 10 lost tribes, that seems to be the background of the coming of the beloved ones, right, in the Apocryphon of James. But it's really not clear, right, just how eschatological this is, as opposed to something that's involving a realized eschatology, sort of lean towards the latter. But anyway, in any event, neither the crucifixion nor the resurrection are considered salvific events in the Apocryphon of James. In the Apocryphon of James, Jesus teaches that you save yourself, right, by knowing yourself and by following the word, right, which is a title for the Torah, of course, according to Jesus' specific interpretation of Torah.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Zinner.
My pleasure. As always, Jacob.
And I just want to remind everybody real quick to, if you want to get the book, The Apocryphon of James, the History Valley Amazon link is in the description below. It will also be in the pinned comment, and it's pinned in the live chat. Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.